Perhaps I should begin by just clarifying what I'm going to be talking about. I've been researching into the relationship between Scotland and Jamaica during what I call the slavery years.
Sorry, Kate.
You've muted Kate.
Well, she wasn't supposed to happen, but I can't automatically. Can you unmute yourself, please, Kate? Thank you.
Am I all right?
Now, yeah. Yes.
Should I start again?
Please.
Yes. Okay. I just want to be clear about what I'm going to talk about for the next sort of half an hour or so. I've been researching a book about Scotland and Jamaica during the years of 1707 to 1834, which I've called the slavery years. And I want to start by giving a little bit of background. And then what I want to focus on is the children of Scottish fathers and Black Jamaican mothers, of which there were many. And some of them came to Scotland, and I'll talk about those, but very many more were left in Jamaica, and I want to talk a little bit about their lives. So it's that relationship. It was actually a physical relationship between the Scots and Black Jamaicans in that period of slavery. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. Can we put up the slide of the little map of Jamaica, which is my second slide, Peter?
Oh, second.
Okay, there's my title. Right. Yep. It's not ever so clear, but the Scots who went to Jamaica, and I'll discuss in a moment what they were doing there, but the Scots who went, they mainly settled themselves in the west of the island and along the northern coast. Jamaica is, but I don't know whether you would know that, but the geography, but Jamaica is very mountainous in the center and has very rich agricultural land around the periphery to the south, the west, and the north. Let's have a look at the next slide. Right. It's a small island. It's not much bigger in land area than Argyll in Scotland. And 1707, as we'll probably know from our history classes, is the date of the Act of Union between Scotland and England. Although that wasn't particularly popular with most Scots at the time, there was a group of Scottish people who were very happy about that link because it opened up great opportunities for them. In the period that I'm talking about, most of the European nations had been busy colonizing parts of the world and then monopolizing that colonial trade for themselves. So the Spaniards were seizing land and keeping that, the products of that land had to come back to the mother country for sale. And the only person who could send and sell things to the people in that new colony were the Spaniards, and the English were doing the same. The Scots were a bit left out because they didn't have a colony of their own. And you may remember that they had an attempt to start a colony in Panama, basically. That was the Darien scheme. So the Union gave some opportunities to a certain class of Scots. One was that when Jamaica was opened up, they encouraged Scots to go there, to take up land, and many of the younger sons of our landed families went there and took up land in Jamaica. And then it opened up many, many trading opportunities too, because the Scots could now legally and be protected by the British Navy to trade across the ocean. So they were trading both with Virginia and the Caribbean islands, but my concentration is going to be on Jamaica. Most of the governors of Jamaica during the time I'm talking about were Scottish, and it was a very prestigious post and very well paid. So Scotland began to develop in 1707 quite a strong relationship with Jamaica. Can I see the next slide? Next one. Okay. This is a little packet boat. Now, at the time, when the Scots decided to try and trade with Jamaica, they didn't have the kind of big ocean-going boats. The people who went there were very small traders with these small kind of packet boats. So it was a dangerous and risky journey, but they were determined to trade, open up trade, particularly with Jamaica. Now, what we know is that the linen industry became Scotland's biggest export, particularly the rough linen cloth that was used to clothe slaves, both in Jamaica and the other Caribbean islands, and also in Virginia. Kippers, interestingly, were slave food, so that the kipper industry, the catching and smoking of herring around the Highlands, expanded massively. And the iron foundries of Scotland, which were just in their infancy at the start of the 1700s, got a massive boost from all the hoes, saws, hinges, nails, all those things that were needed for digging the ground and building houses and building everything in the islands. And then the salt beef and Madeira and those kind of good French wines, as those who settled in Jamaica began to make money, they sent home for all those kinds of luxury goods that they wanted to indulge themselves in. So the traders were going backwards and forwards, and they were expanding, and they became very important to the economic growth of Scotland during those years. The others who went were the sugar planters, the younger sons of the landed on the whole at the beginning, who took up land in Jamaica, and then as they went into the sugar industry, which was at that time the most lucrative crop that you could plant. It made 4 times the profits of anything else. They needed people to work for them, because as we'll see in a moment, these sugar plantations were big. They needed overseers to manage the whole operation. They also wanted young men that had the euphemistic name of bookkeepers, who actually were cracked the whip over the slaves, but kept the books, kept doled out the rations and ordered them, and kept careful accounts for the planters. And then the planters had lawyers, because they often had borrowed money, and the banks in Scotland wanted to know that money was being spent wisely. So the lawyers reported on that. During the years we're talking about, especially by about the middle of the 1700s, Scotland produced 8 out of 10 of the doctors in Britain, and plantations, with their massive number of slaves, found it useful to have a contract with a doctor who would inoculate their slaves against smallpox. Smallpox had been brought from Europe, but the African slaves that they had no defense from it. And so they were experimenting. This is long before Jenner and those people who are, credited with pioneering inoculation. Long before that, Scottish doctors were working in Jamaica, inoculating the slaves. And then, of course, they needed a whole lot of artisans, stonemasons, coopers who made barrels to carry the rum and the sugar home, distillers, carpenters. So it became one of those places where men who've got any skills could flock to make money. Now, those families who left Scotland settled in Virginia, so that those who intended to settle as a family went to North America. But Jamaica attracted young men, and it was a society of young men. And they didn't necessarily stay forever in Jamaica. They went backwards and forwards. So the traders went backwards and forwards. The bookkeepers went for a few years to make money. Stonemasons and coopers spent a few years there and came back perhaps with enough money to buy a bit of land or set themselves up in business. Next slide, please, Peter. Now, I thought it would be nice to just see a picture of a plantation. And we can see on this, on the plantation, the slaves. We can see the cattle that were kept for fertilizer. So the dung was used to fertilize the sugar fields. In the buildings in the foreground are the sugar factory and the arch. Can you see the arch aqueduct? Most of these plantations they needed a lot of water on their fields, and it brought water down from the mountains in the center of the island. And this is why they needed all these masons and people, skilled artisans, because it was quite a big operation they were building. If we look in at the little band of slaves with their hoes, which were probably made in Scotland, this was a Scottish estate, you'll see that about half of the figures are actually female. Now, we often think of the slaves working in the fields as being men, but the majority of them actually were teenage girls and young women because the men were often trained to assist the coopers or to learn to be masons or to become carpenters. So the skilled jobs were given to the black male slaves, and the unskilled work in the fields was done by young women. Can we see the next one, please, the next slide? Now, just to give you an idea of the size of things, Pemberton Valley, which belonged to the Hamilton family. Oh, I'm hearing a noise. Pemberton Valley is just one example I've taken. I've been going through their papers while I've been writing. It belonged to the Hamilton family. It was a small estate with 149 slaves, 90 men and 59 women. That was an unusual estate in having so few women. In fact, the male slaves complained a lot because there weren't enough women to go around, they said. Holland Park was a more typical estate, and that belonged to the Taylor family, an East Coast family. They had 400 slaves, half of whom were women. So there would have been 200 women, and most of them young and working in the fields. Let's have a look at the next slide. When I was going through the Hamilton's papers, I decided to have a look at the church, the Kirk session papers in Ayrshire, because I wanted to know whether the Kirk had anything to say about slavery during that period. So, but what I didn't find very much anything about slavery actually, but I did find, and something that I knew vaguely, how the Kirk sessions were obsessed with sexuality as sin. It seemed that the local population were encouraged to spy on each other to see if there were any people who are unmarried, any widows having male visitors, any servants found in bed together, pregnant girls that to be punished, or too much, or dancing. They didn't like certain kinds of dancing, men and women meeting in the woods. There were all kinds of investigations into people's sexuality, and witnesses were called, and if people were found to be guilty in the opinion of the Kirk of some kind of sexual misdemeanor, then they had to stand on a stool in the Kirk for several weeks until it was deemed that they had been sufficiently punished and that they looked contrite about their sins, and they often were fined quite substantial amounts of money for these offences. I put that in because I want us to realise that all the young men who went to Jamaica, this was the world they left behind. It was very strictly regulated. Sexuality, dancing, contact between men and women was very strictly regulated. And I see the next slide. Now, the law was very different in Jamaica. A man could do what he liked with the women he owned and the women he managed. And so it was Jamaica gained a reputation for wild sexual activity. And these are three examples that have taken. There was a man called Thomas Thistlewood who kept a diary of all of his days in Jamaica. And most of his neighbours, the Scottish, he lived in Westmoreland in the west, and Mr. Cope that he spoke about. Can people read that? He held for his neighbours drinking and sex parties, you might basically call it, and he was not. He felt perfectly comfortable with writing the details of what went on. So Mr. Cope and Mr. Coppage come and stayed all night. Mr. Cope had Sylvia, and Mr. Coppage had Egypt Susanna, and he gave her 6 bits. That's like a sixpence, but she pissed the bed. And he kept. And the one at the bottom, Robert Wedderburn. Robert Wedderburn was the son of a Scottish doctor called Wedderburn. There were 3 brothers who went to Jamaica. A Scottish doctor called Wedderburn, and he was a mixed race son. He was born to one of Wedderburn's slaves. In his later life, he came to Britain, and he joined the anti-slavery campaign, but he also wrote his life story. And what he had to say about his father was that his father ranged through the whole household for his own lewd purposes. And also, if any of the girls had a child, well, it was an acquisition that one day might fetch something in the market. A child of a slave belonged to the owner of the slave and could be sold in the market. Now the next slide, please. The other place where we can find out about the children of these men who went to Jamaica is all landowners, people with property, registered their wills, and the archives in Jamaica have a massive amount of wills, and some of those, many Scottish names are listed there, and some of those we can look at. So the will of a James Hutchison was one of the ones that I picked out, a trader from Ayr. Now he had 3 sets of children in Jamaica. Peggy Powell had William, Henry and Mary. Elizabeth Hunt had Jean, Eleanor, Margaret, David, Charlotte and James. And there was also a Jane Collingwood, who might be a recent acquisition of his. And he said if she has any children, he's going to leave money, a child by him, then he was going to leave money to that child. So he's actually giving away here in his will £9,000, which in those, you need to multiply by 100 to get some idea of the kind of sums that he's disposing of. He has a huge fortune. I don't know what the Hutchison family in Ayr would think of him leaving so much money to his children in Jamaica, but equivalent of nearly £100,000. He's giving each one 100,000. So William, Henry, Mary, so 900,000 he's giving away. So he like many has made a huge amount of money. Next slide, please, Peter. Now, it was very important in that time of slavery because slavery was always controversial. It was always controversial in Scotland because the church said that religion taught the biblical. I suppose that what the Old Testament was taken as biblical truth, that we are all descended from Adam and Eve, and therefore there can't be different. There may be different sorts of people, but they were all people. People of colour, black, white, were all God's children. That was what the Scottish people believed. But so it was also the case that one shouldn't be buying and selling one's fellow men. So it was always a controversial thing. And in order to, but in the early part of the century, although people may not have thought much taken up the issue, and as they did in the latter part of the century, it's controversial. And it was important to those who had slaves and dealt in slaves to try to convince everybody else that people of color, that Black people were very different. They might even be a different species. They were not like us. They were not fully human. And so in Jamaica, they brought in legislation to try to keep a separation between Black and white, because the sexual habits of all those in Jamaica were actually mixing up the colors, and also that there were now educated and wealthy colored people, which disproved the idea that Black and white were so very different. So they brought in legislation, I suppose you'd call it the first apartheid legislation, that all people of color could only move around the island with a ticket from their owner, that they couldn't testify in court, that their inheritance was limited. But the most important thing for Scotland was there were schools for white children only. Sorry, my phone's going on. I need to put it off. Right. That only white children could go to school. Now, so this led to the Scots looking to the well-developed school system that we had in all of the little parishes around Scotland. Scots sent or brought many of their favourite children home. And I want to give an example here, and this is where I'll get on, but finish with the background and really get on to the some of these children. There's some figures there. Scots probably far, because we know, because we know that if we look at the figures, there was perhaps 100,000 children of mixed race, children of colour in Jamaica. And from estimates that were made at the time by Scots, we know that perhaps 30,000 of them had Scots fathers. There may have been as many as 50,000. Now, to go back to the Taylor family that owned the Hampden estate with the 400 slaves, that estate was owned by a man called Simon Taylor, and his nephew, John, came to Jamaica to help Simon manage their business. They had a slaving business, they had a money lending, a merchant business. And just as Simon did, when he arrived in Jamaica, he picked out one of the slaves to be his sexual partner, and she was called Polly. And he and Polly had 3 children, the eldest of whom was James. Now, his mother at home in Montrose knew nothing of his family, but when he decided that as James got to the age of about 4 or 5, that he ought to think about James's schooling, he wrote to his mother in Montrose about James. And she wrote back to say that she was pleased that he had a child, but pleased not to have any more until he was married. Because what worried her was not that James was a child of colour, a brown child, a mixed race child. What worried her was that he was illegitimate. And she said she would be glad to have him home to Montrose, but she was then concerned about what the neighbours would say about his illegitimacy. Because, as we've said, so it was decided that, first of all, John had to confess to his mother that it wasn't just one child, there were 2 more. But all 3 children went home to Montrose, and Jean, the grandmother, decided that the best thing for the children would be to stay with their Aunt Kitty in the countryside and go to the parish school there. So James and his siblings came home to Scotland and stayed just outside Montrose. When they got to the age of secondary schooling, they were sent to a school near Durham in England. John Taylor came home. I think we know perhaps enough about slavery to realise that it was a sort of 3-cornered business that they had planned. The Taylors had offices in London. They had ships in Liverpool, and they went down to Africa and picked up slaves. And their main business, where they made a huge amount of money, was actually slaving. Now, when James left school, his father, John, by now was settled in London, and he had made the legitimate marriage that his mother had wanted him to make. But James and his siblings, their mother Polly was left in Jamaica, as these women were. James was apprenticed into his father's industry and worked in the offices, and he wasn't very happy there. We don't really know why, whether he was unhappy with being in the slave business or just didn't like office work. But the family decided that James would be happier if they could get him a commission in the East India Company. But by the time James was old enough to do that, the East India Company had also brought in a kind of strict rule that there were to be no black people serving in the company. So the difficulty now was to try and get James into the company without exposing the fact that he had a black mother. So James at the interview was required to say that he was the child of a white mother, but he'd lost his birth certificate. And they cut off all his hair so that he didn't have that distinctive African hair, powdered his face with white powder, and put him in a blue suit in the hope that he would pass the test. And he did. He was accepted into the company, and he went off to serve in the colonial administration in India. And he wrote to his grandmother, who was poorly at the time, to say goodbye to her. So that was James. The other, I might also just say a little bit about the Shand family as another example. We know that the Shand family were slave traders out of Liverpool, and they had land in Jamaica. And there were several sons of the Shand family in Jamaica, and one of them had 7 children. And when he came back from Jamaica to make his legitimate marriage, he brought his 7 children with him. And at the moment, somebody's doing some research into those children. But what we do know is that 2 of the 7, John and Francis, John went to work. The Shand family had interests in South Wales. The Bute family, Scottish Bute family, owned the coal mines in South Wales, and John was working there shipping coal. Frances never married, and she went to live with him in South Wales, and she started up a workshop for the blind, where they were making baskets which could carry the coal, and she became a benefactor of what became the Cardiff and then the South Wales Blind Association. She left a lovely mansion to them and quite a lot of money. And Frances spent her final years in Switzerland with part of the fortune that her father had given her. But they were not typical, although we know that most of the landed families, and there were perhaps several hundred of them, who had properties in Jamaica, most of them would have had children of colour. So we're talking about a large number of children, but most of the 30 to 50,000 children that we're talking about would not have had that kind of life. When I was looking through the Hamiltons, that's the other plantation that I mentioned. When I was looking through their papers, they sent home regular lists of their slaves because they often borrowed money to buy them, and the Hamiltons were not unusual in doing that. In the list of slaves, they usually marked those who had one white parent. They were called mulattoes, and they were marked as such. So a mixed race child is called mulatto. Now, when I was looking through the Hamiltons papers, I found 3 mixed race children, 2 boys and a little girl. And they were probably the children of the previous manager, the previous overseer. of the estate, and he was called Mr. Sterling. Mr. Sterling would never have earned enough money to take his 3 children home with him. He left them in Jamaica. So, but it happened later on that I saw in the correspondence that a man called Adam Ferguson had written on behalf of a man called Mr. Cameron. Now, Mr. Cameron was married, was living with a woman called Margaret, and they now had 4 children. And he was requesting the Hamilton family to free Margaret and the 4 children, because these children belonged to the Hamilton family. Because Margaret belonged to the Hamilton family, whether she was living with somebody else or not, she and her children belonged to the family, and they would either have to agree to release them or to agree to sell them to the man who wanted them. So the letter was asking, could they make some arrangements so that Margaret could be freed, and also her 4 children, because she was now had been living obviously happily for some years with Mr. Cameron. The Hamilton family had always been a bit short of labour on their plantation, and it was one of the quarrels that they had with Mr. Sterling way back, and why he gave up his job. And so they decided to drive a very hard bargain. They wanted an exchange for Margaret and for the 4 children. They wanted 5 good male strong slaves in exchange. Now, such a number of slaves would be very expensive purchase for Mr. Cameron. And I don't know what happened. I just saw the exchange of letters. So we don't know what happened to them. So, but that would be a more typical case. Although there were thousands, perhaps, perhaps 1,000, perhaps more, came to Scotland over the years. There were many more thousands were left in Jamaica. But nevertheless, the question I wanted to pose was that today's Jamaicans, we know many of them have Scottish surnames, they must be closely related to Scottish people. And whilst we've always had very close relations with our white diaspora, New Zealand and Canada and those in Virginia and America, we seem to have lost somewhere our relationship with Black Jamaica. And it's likely, it seems to me, that given the large number of Scots and the concentration, although it's a very small country, the proportion of Jamaicans who are related to us is probably much higher than the proportion of Canadians or New Zealanders or others. But we are very closely related to Jamaica. And that's the question I wanted to pose for us. And what happened to our in the days that I'm talking about, Jamaica was, we had people were very proud of their relationship with Jamaica. It was a very prestigious thing to be Jamaican, to be a white Jamaican or a white person with property in Jamaica. So what happened to that relationship? I thought we could pause here if anybody wanted to say anything. If not, we can go on a little bit.
Anybody got any questions, observations, put on the chat?
What was a great difficulty for the children, for white fathers, was it was very, very expensive to free the children unless you own them. If you own them, what you did with them was your concern. But many of these children were the children of the artisans, the bookkeepers, the estate managers, and they wouldn't earn enough because it cost about maybe 70 to £100 to free a slave. These men would possibly not earn that in 1 year or even 2 years if they were young. So it was beyond possibilities for all of them to do very much to the children. Doesn't mean that they weren't affectionate to them, although we can't say what proportion had a loving father, like the hutchison trader that I spoke about. We don't know. Hill.
I'm muted, unmute myself. How were the mulattoes left behind regarded by local Jamaicans?
Local Jamaicans, they were acceptable. When they were high class mulatto children were accepted in high class society in Jamaica, although they added a complication to that whole idea that black and white were different. They were accepted when they were the children of middle classes. There were so many of them that by the end of the 1700s and the early 1800s, they were a group of people on their own, and they were often, sometimes they were skilled labor, because one of the things that an artisan or an overseer of an estate could do is perhaps apprentice them to a carpenter or a mason or a blacksmith, and they became the kind of artisan class in the town. So in Montego Bay was quite a large town, in Kingston, in Savannah, Lamar, in the towns around Jamaica, they became the kind of artisan class, and they had made a reasonable living, made a reasonable life. But that was a kind of threat, in a way, to the whole slave system, because it provided a model for slaves to say, you don't have to live like this. We're skilled. We could go and become carpenters or cooks, or we could live in another way. So it was a challenge.
Could I ask about the original indigenous population of Jamaica? Could you say, I just have no idea about that.
Right, okay. When the Spanish were the first invaders of Jamaica, and when they invaded, there was an indigenous population, and that was swelled by Spanish people and also by the slaves that the Spaniards brought. So there was an indigenous population, and they were driven back into the mountains. Now, many of them were destroyed by the illnesses that came from Europe over time. So they were a much smaller population by the time the Brits took over the island. Now, they fought with the British government and were driven back into the mountains. And they were so ferocious and knew their island so well that the Brits had to make a kind of agreement with them, a legal agreement, to say, we will leave you alone in the mountains if you leave us alone. But over the period I'm talking about, there were regular sort of mutinies of these groups of indigenous people, and their numbers were swelled by runaway slaves. If slaves ran away, they ran away into the mountains, and there was and joined these bands who were living independently. And eventually the British government forced on the groups in the mountains, forced them to agree that if slaves came to them, that they would return them and that they would pay them handsomely for doing that. They also asked for their assistance in times of mutiny, and they fought quite often on the side of the British government when there was a mutiny of slaves. So they were brought down from the mountains to round up the runaway slaves and to help in those circumstances. So they were, I would say their arms were twisted behind their back, but they did act to defend themselves and to support the British government in its oppression of the slaves.
Is that the people that get called, sorry, is that the people that get called the Maroons?
That's the Maroons, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, yes, sorry. Yes, that's the Maroons.
Thank you very much.
I noticed that the families that you had identified and followed were all from Ayrshire. And I wondered if that was just because that was the research you were doing, or if that was significant to
I think that the first traders who went out went from the west because they were well positioned. So people who when trading in 1707, when trading was first allowed and defended, although Scots traded across the sea before that, but it was on a kind of illegitimate basis. The west coast, Ayrshire, and all up the west coast, people went from Inveraray in little boats from Wigtown. Now, in the south, in Dumfries and Kirkcudbright, they were very much involved in the slave trade, but so the southern part of Scotland was much more involved in trade than it was in settlers, but there were settlers from that part. The East Coast settlers came mainly after the 1745 rebellion, and they were Episcopalians. So the Taylor family, James Taylor's family and his granny called Jean, they were strict Episcopalians, which is why they would have been disturbed about James being an illegitimate child. After 1745, very many of the East Coast families had their land confiscated if they took part in that rebellion and they were on the wrong side, the side that lost. So those that fought that were Jacobites, one of the punishments they had was to lose part or all of their land. So they sent a lot of younger sons. So the Shans, the Drummonds, and the Taylors that I spoke about, the Stirlings, they were all families from the East Coast, the Wedderburns too, who sent their younger sons either as physicians. The Grant family sent sons to Jamaica, and they might have worked doctors at the beginning and then bought some land and then settled. So yes, actually the East Coast were the more numerous in the end than the West Coast people. Are there any further thoughts? I'll give you what I think. I suppose the question, what happened to that relationship? In the early years, in the middle of the century, people were very proud of the money they made in Jamaica. And Scotland, because we can say that the linen industry, the iron foundries, the fishing industry, and very much more, benefited hugely from the trade. So those people who were involved in that trade and who were even the people who were selling their kippers or whatever, a large 270,000 people worked in the linen trade, and many of them in the early years were actually producing that linen at home. So it was a very, it raised the standard of living in places in Forfar, for instance. If we look at the statistical account of Scotland, which is one of the very good records of change in Scotland in the century, the statistical account shows that there was a huge change in people's lives as they got cash from the sale of their linen, and that linen went off to Jamaica. So it was very important to a section of the Scottish population who came to either support vocally or tacitly the trade. On the other hand, as the Scottish people became more educated, more enlightened, they were religious. They were strongly religious in a way that perhaps people were not in England. Religion meant something to them. They knew their Bibles. They knew that we were all descended from Adam and Eve. The other side of that other half of the population, from quite early on, thought the whole thing was immoral. So that division between the supporters and those who were against it became very vociferous. And the newspapers were full of letters and articles. It was raised in the Scottish, the church assembly. Every year it was raised. It was often it was defeated in the assembly, that the moderate party, the more conciliatory part of the Presbyterian religion, which didn't want to upset the British state, didn't want to take up a controversial anti-position, but certainly on the ground in the local Kirks, religious people who knew about it were very against. So the country was divided over that period, over the whole issue. And because I think the abolitionists won the argument and slavery was seen as immoral, I do think that those families who had brown children and had brown relatives and had land and whatever in Jamaica were less proud of it and were more keen to hide it. And it's actually quite hard to find what happened to many of the children. But if you go through the wills in Jamaica, you can see that many Campbells from the West Coast went off to, they were some of the first settlers in Jamaica. Their letters actually have been published and they're quite open about the Campbell children. The Malcolms, who were a branch of the Campbells in Argyll, they picked out one or two of their children. Dougal Campbell was a favoured son, and he was of a black mother, and he went off. They bought a commission for him in the army. The Stirling's children, 3 of them, Stirling's, there were 3 sons that they brought back to Britain, and those 3 fought very bravely for the British government, I think, against the in the American War of Independence on the British side, and also at Waterloo. What they often seemed to do for them was to buy them commissions or to find them places in the colonial administration. So a lot of those Scots who went off and made names for themselves in the colonies were probably children of black mothers. One little thing which intrigued me about the Shan children, the 7 Shan children, when they came home, their black mother requested that each one of them was given her portrait, a little portrait of her. Now, if she wanted them to know of her existence and that she loved them, a letter would have done. But I thought the idea that she wanted them to have a little picture of her is perhaps she wanted them to know that they had a black mother in Jamaica, because these children were often, as James Taylor was, expected to deny their parentage. And I thought it was interesting that she wanted them to go with a little portrait.
Kate, another wee question popped up there from Hazel. Did many men go to Jamaica from Ireland? Did your research find any Irish connections in Jamaica?
There is an Irish connection. It's not as strong as Scotland's. I think that Scotland, of course, Ireland only became a full part of, was it 1820 something, wasn't it?
Oh,
when
yeah.
Ireland became fully British, and sent, it was in the 1822 election, I think, that they sent British members to sent members of Parliament to the British Parliament, to Westminster. So they joined much later. So there were Irish traders, but they didn't have the same freedom as the Scots did in the 1700s, because they were not fully part of the British state. So they would have been interlopers. They wouldn't have been protected by the Navy. They wouldn't have been fully legitimate to be in Jamaica, because they were not British at that point to the same
extent. I was curious because of the connection with linen, obviously, because Ireland was so famous for its linen.
What were you thinking, Hazel?
I thought that perhaps because of the importance of linen.
Yes.
In Jamaica, perhaps the Irish merchants would have cottoned on to that pretty quickly.
The Hamilton family that I mentioned were a junior branch of the whole kind of Hamilton clan. And they had been linen traders before they became involved in Jamaica. Now, a lot of the linen that was processed in Scotland was not grown here. It came from Ireland. So Irish linen was being processed in Forfar and going from Forfar to Jamaica, and it was a rough kind of cloth. In fact, the slaves said that you could scratch your back by lifting your shoulders up and down, that it was so uncomfortable. So there was that connection, but it's a little bit more distant. that's not to say that Irish traders didn't go to, and that Irish people didn't live in Jamaica, but not on the great numbers. I began to feel that 1707 was the Act of Union, but it was also the moment when Jamaica was made a full British colony. And I began to feel that although it was written into the agreement between England and Scotland, that Jamaica would now be open to them for trading and for land, I wondered if other deals were done, because almost all of the governors of Jamaica were Scottish, and certainly the first few after 1707. And I did wonder whether, you know, that was part of the understanding, because it wasn't, the union wasn't particularly popular with the general population, but it was very advantageous to a certain class of Scots. And I felt that maybe these landed families whose sons went to be the very well paid and highly prestigious governors, why were they all Scottish? I thought perhaps it was all part of the bribe, if that makes sense. But the Hay family were, now they weren't the governors, but they were the chief justice for a while in Jamaica in the 1700s. Now the Hay children went to school in Dornoch. If you read, there's no clear thread of literature, but in all sorts of places, if you look at accounts of the time, people's memoirs, people's letters, the wills and baptismal certificates in Jamaica, which are quite well kept, they turn up all the time. But there were I think 3 or 4 Hay brothers who went to school in Dornoch. We don't know, a lot of the paperwork that might give us more knowledge of all these children actually was brought up by American universities who had black researchers who were interested. We were not particularly interested for a while in looking after all this history. And a lot of it now belongs to libraries in America. But fortunately for us and for me when I was researching, a lot of it is publicly available and online. So they have catalogued a lot of it. So there's probably more in America than there is here in our archives. Although most of the local libraries in Scotland, I went to Dumfries and I went to Ayr and I went to Loch Gilphead. Most of the libraries in their archives have letters and other material from families writing backwards and forwards, because we were a literate nation and we wrote to each other. And what is amazing is how often we travel backwards and forwards. That the sons of families, I suppose we had transatlantic families, and who for about 100 years went backwards and forwards, sending their sons and their relatives, visiting each other, sending presents backwards and forwards, sending letters backwards and forwards. The relationship was really close. And the children would have been, if they were sending children home, they would come backwards and forwards with one of the relatives.
Can I ask something? Did many white women go over to Jamaica with husbands or brothers?
Very, very few. It was overwhelmingly a white male group. So when we talk about maybe 30,000, over the century, there were 20 to 30,000 Scots, but the vast majority of those were male. The white women did go, especially in the early years, but latterly the men lived there and lived family lives there, had partners, long-term partners and children, but they came home and they were anxious, having made money, and perhaps they were new money, they wanted to marry into the aristocracy, into the landed class. So they came back and made advantageous white marriages. often bringing the children home with them. Sometimes these white women here were not that keen on all these brown children that were brought back, and recorded their disapproval, but they often were sent away to school, and so they didn't have an awful lot to do with them. But the liaisons were the white liaison was usually made when they came home, and there were very few white women, although mulatto girls, the children of a white father and a black slave mother, those girls, those brown girls, were favoured as wives or partners for white men in Jamaica. So men who stayed in Jamaica often found themselves, which is why Margaret was picked out, I think, as a mulatto girl. Mulatto girls, there was a lot of romantic poetry written to them because they were considered to be both exotic and beautiful. And there's some racy little romantic novels written about these liaisons, but also some poetry written. But there were very few white women in Jamaica, which is one reason why there were so many brown children, because there was these were young men, and in a period in history when very little was known about contraception, so liaisons produced children. There were literally tens of thousands of them, and we were no exception. There were perhaps 30,000, 50,000 brown Scots children. They're children of Scotsmen.
Any other questions, observations before we round up? Any other? We've had lots of questions, observations. Anyone else got? No, nothing. Well, thank you very much, Kate. That's really interesting, informative. And I note that you have a book coming out. When's your book coming?
I don't have a date for it, but it is this year.
It's not time.
It's called Scotland and Jamaica, the whole story.
Okay.
And it's coming out later in the year. It will be published by the Edinburgh Press, Lewis Press in Edinburgh, but we don't have a date as yet.
Okay, well, we look forward to hearing more about that when it comes. And yeah, thanks a lot. And I know it's not easy on Zoom, but I think your sound for me was absolutely fine. I could hear you.
Well, that's good to know.
Yeah, that was good.